Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining Open for Business with Conor Flynn, CEO of Kimco. As a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, to please submit them using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you all for joining us for Open for Business with Conor Flynn. Coresight has continued to host these dynamic forums since early March as a platform to discuss opportunities and challenges as all of our businesses continue to evolve in ways only once imagined. Speaking of, we have a research report series entitled Retail Reimagined, which has covered everything from live streaming to group buying. The most recent edition covered rethinking product creation to drive consumer demand, collaboration, and customization. We will ultimately be publishing an ebook with all these different topics and chapters to really provide a roadmap for technologies and solutions to adapt in this ever-changing environment. We are very honored to have the CEO of Kimco, Conor Flynn, with us today. His distinguished career includes well over a decade at Kimco with roles of increasing responsibility. He joined the company in 2003 as an asset manager, quickly progressed to the VP and president roles of the Western region. He then took over the COO reins, CIO role, and ultimately the CEO position in 2016. We have shared many a stage together, and I always learn from him and find his openness to be very inspiring. Conor, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Deborah.
So let's kick it off with a question regarding, kind of the openings and what we've seen. How have, your tenants reached their consumers, kind of balancing this online and offline role of the physical store, especially as we've seen, kind of fulfillment continue to evolve?
Yeah, no, that's exactly, I think, where things are headed in retail. If you look at sort of the blurring of the lines between retail, fulfillment, and distribution. I mean, for example, Deborah, how have you been shopping in the pandemic? Have you been going to the grocery store, going in? Have you been curbside pickup? Have you been ordering online and having it delivered to your home? What's been your choice?
It's interesting because not only, right, I think myself and others have we discovered, online platforms that we didn't know existed, but even shopping more locally, right? Discovering that there is, kind of produce that we didn't know. So I think it's this idea that not only have large companies who have very sophisticated e-commerce, but there's also been this opportunity for the kind of little shops as well. And that's what I think is really interesting about this environment is just, kind of where the opportunities are for the winners.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that we're dealing with right now because everybody is still somewhat, staying at home, somewhat, trying to emerge back into a new way of life. And we're starting to see a lot of trends that I think are going to continue, which is there's really just like a suite of amenities that people want. They want optionality and they want value and they want convenience. And what we've seen is that the grocery stores, which have remained open obviously through this pandemic, have realized that their store network is critically important to servicing their customers. And they're trying to think more along the lines of, okay, now that we recognize how important the store base is, how do we go about reinventing it to become more of that distribution and fulfillment point? And, with curbside pickup, I think being widely adopted, that's sort of the big one for me anyways, that I see is just going to continue to accelerate even post-pandemic. It's because in a lot of ways, it's like a quick and easy way for a retailer to become omnichannel in a very quick moment. And, even for the small shops that we were talking about earlier, when, you've got a retail store that potentially does not have the major infrastructure of like a large conglomerate, they can quickly realize that, hey, their customer base can be served. They have a bigger catchment area. They can do more volume if they start to incorporate, e-commerce and curbside pickup and utilize their store from that distribution point of view.
Well, I mean, it's really been amazing, right? I mean, you've seen not only, I'm sure some of your very large retailers who've adapted, very quickly, whether it's curbside or pickup or last mile. And then many of these, kind of smaller businesses that hadn't previously been online, the pace with which it's all changed has truly been amazing. And I mean, how do you think about the kind of innovation speed and what have been some of the learnings so far for yourself and for Kimco?
Well, if you look at what we've done over the past few years, we've transformed the portfolio to be tightly concentrated in the top 20 metro markets of the country. And so we were really betting on density because we figured, our real estate's going to be worth more in the long term if we have, infill locations and have high barriers to entry where you're not going to have new competition coming across the road or down the street. And what's interesting is because of like the leaders in omnichannel going into this, Home Depot, which is our second largest tenant, the Albertsons companies, and as well as Ahold Delhaize and you name it, with Whole Foods. These are our largest tenants that were already widely being leaders of the omnichannel revolution. And now what's interesting is it's just been sort of accelerated so that everybody else can follow along. I think Target has done a wonderful job of really being forward thinking and understanding what the customer wants and needs are. And you're seeing now more demand for that last mile location. So grocery stores, for example, home improvement stores, for example, off-price is back on offense. If you look at, all the categories that have seemed to have figured out, how do we take advantage of this opportunity? They see that as a unique way of saying, let's look where the density is, where our loyal customer is, and how do we go about putting more last mile stores there because they can be used in a number of different ways.
Well, that's what's so interesting, right? Because now in some ways, and especially as we kind of go into holiday, this idea of fulfillment, and I do think there's a lot of concerns over, kind of supply chain, those last few weeks of December. But if the power is in the consumer's hands, right? If they can ultimately, kind of come to a center and, either curbside pickup if they, kind of choose to do BOPUS. But that's what's really interesting. And, what are you seeing? I mean, we've heard so many kind of different, or really interesting new innovations around, kind of, warehouse space, distribution space, fulfillment space in these centers. How does all that come together?
So it's really, really early, right? So I think some of the conversations that are going on right now are very preliminary and trying to reinvent maybe what department stores of the future may look like, what industrial may look like. There's going to be case studies where it definitely lends itself to a changing of use. For example, our redevelopment strategy was adding density on our properties by adding multifamily. So, creating that mixed use where you sort of feed off each other, all the uses enhance each other. Industrial is also an interesting angle for us that we're really taking a look at, but there's some barriers there. A retail shopping center is one that, is typically anchored by a grocery store. Kimco is over 80% grocery anchored and home improvement anchored. So we already have sort of the core essential anchor in place. What we see is more of that center of store being reimagined. And so if you think about it, when you walk into a grocery store, typically, you walk around the perimeter and that's where you get your produce, your fish and your meat, the specialty items. And then the center of store is more the commodity type product. And, Albertsons had an announcement today that they're partnering with a vertical farm to do a lot more, sustainability farming to give them fresh produce in a unique way. And it's really interesting to see what some of the innovations that are coming out of some of the pandemic issues are really forcing people to be nimble, forcing people to try different things. But that's where I see sort of the big shift coming in our store experience is that center of store, that commodity piece. We've seen a lot of different examples of how people are trying to make that a mini distribution center or a micro fulfillment center, in essence, automate that entire spot where you come in the door. You probably can order your commodity type items on your phone and then have it be ready for you at checkout after you've shopped the produce and the fish and the meat, because that's where people really like selection and want to be able to choose. So those are the types of things we're seeing that we're excited about.
You talk about this idea of kind of reimagining the center of the store. How is Kimco kind of reimagining, kind of the parking lot, if you will? How is that kind of a draw to consumers? And as you're also thinking about kind of dedicated space for, kind of online fulfillment, what does all of this look like?
Yeah, so luckily we're in the open air shopping center sector. So we have, an inviting shopping center where we have typically it's 75 to 80% of our real estate is actually just parking. So to your point, that's where we see a lot of potential for innovation, for creativity, to really push the envelope on what we can do with our real estate. And with ride sharing, I think there's going to be a less of a requirement for the amount of parking stalls that are currently mandated. That's the reason we have all those big fields of parking, is because they're mandated by the municipality. And so when I look into the future, I really do see parking ratios already starting to come down, which allows us to do unique things with our parking lot. We've done a lot of creative things, especially during the pandemic when there's been capacity constraints for restaurants and service type users. We've activated green space, we've put picnic tables out, we've done a lot of sidewalk cafes, try to like invoke the European square model where there's tables and chairs flowing out, taking parking stalls, obviously the curbside pickup program that we launched nationwide. It's really sort of trying to reinvent and activate the outdoors so that people feel comfortable, because it's really all about safety right now, to get people to come back to the shopping center, which our traffic is only down about 10% year over year, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And so we think that there's different unique ways that our parking lot continue to evolve to create a welcoming environment, because that's the key.
Well, I mean, the whole idea that, first of all, consumers want to spend time together. We all, we're social human beings, right? We want to meet new people, kind of doing it safely and at a distance. It seems like, you have a huge opportunity, and that also extends to your tenants, right? As they want to, whether it's entertain their customers, have them get to know, the retailer in a different way. We've got to, if we think about a lot of the innovation that's happened already in 2020, it seems to me, I would never have thought of the parking lot as, kind of playing a role in innovation, but it really seems like there is a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, it's, retail has been changing forever, right? I mean, we call it retail Darwinism, where it's just been a constant, who's the winners and who's the losers. You look back at when Kimco went public, and our top 10 list then is almost entirely different than it is now. And so if you have good real estate, if you have the locations that'll continue to evolve to serve the customer base that surrounds it, that's where we think there's really a lot of upside, because, to your point, the parking lot is really untapped potential for us. And we've seen, a lot of the new uses, whether it's, everybody loves like a Chick-fil-A, everybody loves like sort of their burger place of choice or their salad place of choice. And then utilizing curbside or drive-through is another way that, again, will continue to probably add more of that convenient aspect to our shopping centers.
You've discussed this idea of retail Darwinism. Has it played out as you expected?
In some ways, yes. I think there's a lot of folks that have been waiting for some of these retailers to really go away because they haven't been innovative. Their business model hasn't changed in decades. They came into this over leveraged. And so some of those uses have been waiting, I guess, for the shoe to drop. There hasn't been any sort of like a surprise in any way, shape, or form on that, because our watch lists have been the same for a while. Everybody knows the retailer brands that have been sort of in a slow motion decline over the last few years, even some decades. But there are some that still are sort of in this gray area where they've got a window to transform. They've got the potential to sort of make it through to the other side. And hopefully they have, the right leaders and the right team and the balance sheet to be able to execute the transformation.
I mean, speaking of balance sheet, how, is or can Kimco, use liquidity already raised to, let's say, invest rescue capital to those in need? And, those in need are, certainly evolving, but how do you think through that?
Yeah, we're in a pretty unique situation there. For retail, for a lot of banks, they pretty much have shied away, especially from, certain forms of retail, not necessarily shopping centers, but you can guess which ones they've shied away from. And, the grocery anchored centers that we have are very much understood. They're traded regularly in the open market. They're easy to underwrite. But the nice part about for Kimco's balance sheet is we're an unsecured borrower. We're a BBB plus Baa1 investment grade credit, same as Starbucks. So it allows us to really access the bond market at a time when rates are all-time lows. Actually, we just did a bond yesterday and printed our lowest coupon ever at 1.9% for a 7-year, $400 million bond. So, it's incredible to see the ability we have to raise very inexpensive debt. We've pushed out our debt maturity profile to over 11 years now, which is one of the longest in the REIT industry. And we have over $2 billion of liquidity available to us. So we're being patient, knowing that opportunities are going to present themselves. Rescue capital is a good way to put it. There's a lot of folks that may not be able to refinance, or may have an issue with the CMBS borrower, or have a mortgage on a property that needs to be taken out. So we feel like we're in a unique position where those folks that don't have the access to capital like we do will be in a unique position to hopefully get some acquisition opportunities there.
That rolls into my next question on, kind of the small businesses, the local, kind of mom and pops that really do kind of, give some flavor into some of these centers and these, kind of top 20 markets. How are you kind of engaging with them differently, whether it be rent concessions, et cetera? And then for those who maybe need a little bit more hand-holding, what does that look like?
Yeah, so the good news for us is the lion's share of our portfolio was deemed essential. So actually we have 94% of our tenants are open for business today. And collections for July actually was over 82%. So we're trending in the right direction and feel like there's a tight correlation between those two. We've had to do more for the small shops, there's no doubt about it, to help them bridge to the other side. We've been pretty firm but fair with our large tenants that were deemed non-essential, that have balance sheets, that have access to capital. We felt like contract law was in place that they should be following. Whereas the small shops that don't have the cash on hand, that don't have the balance sheet to lean on, they're the ones that we've gone above and beyond to try and make sure that they have, a glimmer of hope anyways, to make sure that they know that the landlord is working with them and want them to make it through. So what we've done is we launched a tenant assistance program, what we call TAP. And what we gave each small shop tenant was the ability to use outside attorneys that we would pay for to help them navigate all the different federal and state funding programs that were available to them. And we had over 600 tenants sign up for it, and they accessed over $20 million of PPP funding. And they're still going. I think that obviously there's a few more that I think we can help in the near term. And our thought process was how do we go about making sure that our tenants are best suited to make it through? We can work with them on their lease, whether it's a rent deferral program or pushing things out, maybe even tying it to a percentage of sales. So they don't have to realize what kind of business model they need to make it through. Because I know it's tricky right now, depending on what use you are, to come up with a capacity constrained business model that'll make sense. And so as a landlord, we're being very thoughtful to make sure that the retailers that came into this that were doing well should be afforded every opportunity to make it through and hopefully get to the other side and be able to be a strong business once again.
I mean, it's really interesting along those lines in terms of not only the partnership you really created with your tenants, but also what we're hearing is kind of some of this, whether it's partnership or collaboration between tenants themselves to share insights and kind of get to the other side of this. As we think about this, kind of let's just say this continued kind of conversations that are being had, what are you seeing that kind of large and small tenants need the most right now?
Well, there's definitely a lot of retail therapy going on right now, which is great to see. I think that's the best therapy in my opinion. So it's nice to see people re-engaging in shopping. And when we talk to our big tenants and our small tenants, they all say similar things. They say that the shopper is back and they're not browsing, they're buying. So they're not coming to just sort of meander through aisles or spend a day, looking for some type of exciting item. They're coming for a purpose, and they're coming to really make sure that they walk away with the goods that they came to buy. The other interesting thing is the basket size, or the amount that people are spending, is definitely larger. And so I think it's one of those things that the pandemic probably had a lot to do with it, where people were nervous that, hey, this item might not be available. Are they going to be out of stock next time that I come here? Instead of buying, one roll, I'll buy 6 rolls type of thing. And you're continuing to see that, is that the basket size is very sizable.
It's really interesting to hear you kind of talk through that, because if we put our hats on going back to the Great Recession, where the consumer definitely shopped in a different way, I would say there was a different type of collaboration. What did you learn from that period of time that you're applying to today, or how did that change your roadmap And what have you learned from that will change how you continue to do things in the future?
Yeah, no, luckily the scars from that are still sort of fresh, I would say. So we had a lot of best practices on deferrals with tenants through that Great Recession. And so, having been with the company as long as I have, we were able to create a tenant tracker, which was a pretty unique tool that we actually developed in 48 hours to take the lessons we've learned in the past from our deferral program and then create a unique deferral program for each tenant. So depending on their use and their ability to make it through. And so communication has always been the key with our retailers. We feel like we're a partner, and it's a difference for us to show that, hey, we look at this as a partnership. And I think there's a lot of loyalty there from our retailers that have seen Kimco step up at a time like this, to recognize that not every landlord is the same. And it's actually quite beneficial to be partners with someone that's large and liquid, because we can step up at a time where others potentially don't have the ability to pay your tenant improvement allowance or pay the work that needs to be done to improve centers. We're in a pretty unique situation where we have capital and we also have a lot of unique insights that we can take from, we launched our curbside pickup program in 24 hours, and it's over 400 sites nationwide. And the adoption rate has been incredible. Consumers are using it regularly. Retailers are asking for more curbside pickup stalls. So it's really an amazing experience to see a team rally together remotely, because that's the other new challenge. Before we were still sort of in the trenches all together, making our way through, knowing that, the small shops in the last Great Recession did take a significant dip. And we knew that going into this, they were going to be the most in need of help. So that's where we quickly catered to them to be sure that communication and the opportunity was there to work together.
Great. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to just kind of dive right in. And if
Sure.
anyone else has additional questions, please just use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So we'll just start at the top. Do you see changes in the traditional merchandising mix for strip centers?
I think there's always going to be changes in merchandising mix. I think there's always going to be innovation coming into play. What you're seeing these days is, if you didn't have a grocery store before in your lineup, that is very much the sector that's in the most demand right now for space. So you have the real opportunity to lower your cap rate and bring in a daily traffic driver in this environment, because typically if you're going to get a space back, at least in our opinion, your best bet is to first look at the best grocer in that trade area to add to that lineup, because it'll really help drive surrounding rents and drive traffic to the shopping center. Off-price is still a dominant force in our shopping centers. TJ Maxx is a wonderful company that continues to do, I think, exciting things in terms of, retail innovation and making people come in. They have a program where they text their loyal shoppers when the trucks are arriving with new merchandise. Burlington and Ross continue to do a great job in that category as well. I think probably what's going to change out of this is more of the restaurants will be flex format. And what I mean by that is they're gonna tweak their model so that their menu might have more accessibility for delivery and pickup. And so a lot of restaurants, I think, had these menus that were large, complex, geared more towards a sit-down function. Whereas I think coming out of this, there's probably going to be more restaurants geared towards the grab and carry type of situation.
Well, it's interesting along those lines, right? In general, we are seeing kind of a whole change around the thought of kind of assortment, this idea of trying to be in stock, and then also demand forecasting so that, retailers can just kind of think about their profitability differently in their mix. So it's been a challenge both for restaurants and for retailers. All right, next question. Could you provide perspectives and insights that pertain to pivoting / including more residential product?
Yeah, so when you look at your property, you always try and, at least in my opinion, the best way to do it is to take a step back and say, if this was a blank, if this was a blank slate, what's the highest and best use? And you look at there's all sorts of different demographics and data sources that you can use that are widely available, and most of them are free, by the way, that you can start to really come to a quick conclusion that, hey, if this was starting from scratch, my highest and best use would probably be maybe 300 apartments or something like that. Or it could be an office tower because of the demand, or it could be industrial, or it could be retail. So, I always try and start from scratch and say, if you had a blank sheet of paper, what would you do? What would you do here? And that helps sort of take steps to make sure that you've got the vision in place early on. And then think of it almost as like a building blocks. You've got to make sure that you understand when each portion of your shopping center will become actionable. So you take your lease roll and you look at the rent roll and you say, okay, I know that on this side of the shopping center, there's demand, there's support by the community that they want to see more residential here. So I should make sure that I line up the leases to all expire at the same time so that I can be ready to go and have a entitlement in place, a development plan in place, ready to be shovel ready as soon as those leases mature, so that your plan is ready to go. And that's what we've done across our portfolio. We've got 5,000 apartment units entitled today. We're shooting to get 10,000 in the next 5 years, because I do see those pieces enhance each other. When you have your built-in customer base that can just, they look at the amenities, and the amenities include maybe a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's, and the amenities could be, a hair and nail salon, a gym, all the things that you would think of in Manhattan for like, the most expensive apartments. They have all those amenities. Well, that's what we bring to the table. We already have all those amenities. That's our shopping center. And so if we can add residential to it, typically you can charge premiums on your residents that are living there, as well as the retail rents.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It's interesting. There's a lot of questions, and we talked about this a little in preparation for today around remote work. And is it here to stay? How is Kimco kind of communicating with employees and kind of handling the remote work environment as an organization? And then I'm trying to put a few questions together. And then as we were seeing more people continue to work from home, how does that change the dynamics of their kind of engagement with your tenants?
So there's definitely challenges from work from home. I think everybody, including myself, has a family that can be challenging at times with little kids, right? Managing and juggling and making sure they don't run in the middle of an important interview. But there's also really great things that have come out of it, and we've learned that. We thought we were great at communication before this. We've realized that we were nowhere near. We've actually improved communication because of this pandemic, and so we're doing twice daily calls with the organization to make sure that the communication is crystal clear of what our goals are, what our strategy is, getting through this and being in a position of strength coming out of this. And I think there's a lot to say about working remotely and efficiently as well as we have. And I think a lot of people have, across the industries, have been actually pleasantly surprised by how efficient people are when they're motivated, when they're engaged, when there's communication, when there's strategy in place, and when they feel empowered to go and execute. And I think that's sort of the big takeaway from this is, there's always going to be a place for the office. I miss going to the office and having coffee with folks. And, there's that, collaboration and that creativity that comes with bouncing ideas off of each other through those random interactions. I don't see that going away, but I do see there's going to be more of a flexible work environment where you don't necessarily have to be at your desk the entire time. I think there's going to be a lot of the things that come out of this where people are going to take bits and pieces of what has worked really well for their organization. Like for us, for example, our calls that include the entire organization, that have Q&A in it, and that make sure everybody understands the situation we're in on a regularly scheduled basis, have been really, really well received. And just have, we have regularly scheduled dialogue so that everybody is in the know of what we're focused on and how we're going to achieve it.
Yeah, no, I think that is, a challenge that everyone's trying to think through, and just kind of what's the, kind of right balance. And it's, I think there is this idea that, we all want to spend time kind of bouncing ideas off of each other, and what are the other formats to do that as well. And it's continuing to evolve. Oh, we have a lot of questions. So first off, he's a fabulous guest. This is from Mark. My question, although your focus, Conor, is not in the mall category, can you offer your perspective on how the enclosed mall will need to evolve? There are several questions on that.
Gosh, it's hard for me because we're not in the thick of it for the mall guys, and I'm rooting for all those folks that are in the mall sector, because obviously there's a lot of challenges there in the department store. I do think that there's, a place for good real estate to reinvent itself. And I think that a lot of the malls were already, one step in that direction. If they had the right real estate, you were seeing them add, whether it's office or residential. And, a lot of those well-located malls have the ability to adapt. I do see, in Europe, they've actually already gone the hybrid approach and looked more like a grocery anchored shopping center versus the traditional mall. So they moved away from fashion a long time ago now that I think about it. And so maybe it's just sort of like the lag here in the US is that I see grocery stores definitely coming to malls. I see them going mixed use in as many ways as they can. I think, they're going to try and reduce their exposure to apparel, which I think is going to be tough for some. And it's all about liquidity. The capital required to reposition the real estate is significant, and you're going to have to accurately plan to make sure you have the dry powder to reinvent it, because it's going to take a lot of capital.
There's a lot of questions around tenants, and I think I will anonymize this, but this idea that are there, kind of certain tenants that you haven't previously considered, or other entities with substantial warehouse, inventory storage functions, et cetera, that you would, kind of consider, and how does this kind of landlord-tenant relationship continue to, to evolve?
It's definitely something that we're always looking for new names to add to our Rolodex and new ideas to add to what we can do with our real estate. Right now, the demand is actually very high for our locations. So because of that last mile sort of flex format that we have, we're actually seeing, we're over 98.2% occupied on our spaces over 10,000 square feet. So I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be some new players that come in and continue to see the validation of the value and convenience that open air shopping centers offer. But we haven't done sort of a full, that's not true. We actually did do a redevelopment where we did a industrial, retail to industrial transformation, and did some cold storage as well. It is so unique to each location that it's hard to generalize. And we're obviously talking about multifamily as well, and that's unique as well to the location. We are seeing some tenants from the mall world come and look to expand in the shopping center world. Most notably, the beauty category. Ulta has been a big player of ours for a long time. Now Sephora has picked, the open air category as really their growth platform. You're seeing it with a few other uses as well. So it's always good to have competition. It's always good to have more than one person bidding for a space. So we continue to have that nice ability to, I think, try different things and pilot different things in our shopping centers. We launched our Keys program, which was, if you're a new entrepreneur and have a new idea that you want to open in one of our shopping centers, we'll give you the ability to have a year free rent to make sure the new idea and the new concept is successful in that first year, and then have the ability to exercise a fair market value option to keep the business going. And it's actually been amazingly successful. We've had over 50% of our Keys tenants exercise their fair market value option, which I thought the success rate would have been a lot lower.
That's unbelievable, and just your support of small businesses is truly commendable. I'm going to close it out with one last question, although there are many, but I thought this was interesting and kind of gives you an opportunity to be a bit, kind of look behind and to look ahead. So this is from Rob. Thank you, Rob. What business decisions that tenants made for reopening did or didn't work? I've seen some overreact, change business plans, and customers didn't return, and sales remain way off, while others are consistently climbing back up. So based on what you've seen, what's your advice?
It's one that I think you have a game plan in place to deal with the challenges at hand. And first and foremost, it's all about liquidity in a time of crisis. And so when you pull together your team and focus on how are you going to make it through, you first and foremost want to get everybody together and have open dialogue of what are the things we can do to boost our liquidity, push out maturity profile, making sure that we want to be, the discussions with our retailers as quickly as we can. You can't lean back in a situation like this. We've always been, you got to call these guys and make sure that everybody's working together, recognizing that those have not been easy calls. I've drawn the short straw on a lot of those calls to have to work with our retailers to help them understand that, hey, look, we're in this together. You can't just not have a dialogue about how to make it through. If you give something and we'll give something, that's usually, if nobody's happy, you've made a good deal. So, in times like this, it's been first and foremost, you got to motivate your team, make sure you come together with the strategic alliance to be sure that everybody's working 24/7 to get through this. Second, your balance sheet, boost your liquidity as best you can. Talk to your lenders. We did a short-term term loan in the midst of the crisis with 15 different banks to come in and to support us. We've already paid that back and termed it out with a 10-year bond. And just continue to have open dialogue with your retailers. Everybody's learning, everybody's trying something new. And as a landlord, we have zero control over what the retailers do inside their four walls, but we can be creative and come up with solutions on how to activate the common area, the parking lot, the green space, the sidewalks. And so that's where we've continued to try and innovate. And, listening to our retailers has been very helpful.
Great. Well, Conor, to close it out, your support of the small business community is truly commendable. I know we didn't get to sustainability, and there's so much that you're doing there, but we really enjoyed our time with you today. What you're doing in terms of keeping everyone open for business, is really making a difference. And thank you so much for your time. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great to see you. Thanks, Deborah.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.